Here we see our first sight of the Cameronians on their last parade. One of the toughest, most famous regiments in the British Army. The Cameronians have since their beginning won for themselves an unsurpassed reputation as fighters. They fight as they pray, they said of the old Cameronians. They pray as they fight. Great numbers of them have lost their lives, but few or none of them ever yielded.
The Cameronians indeed prayed as they fought, for they drew their roots from the followers of Richard Cameron, a militant Presbyterian of the tumultuous 17th century. The faith was strong with the regiment, every new member being issued a Bible, and every company having a Presbyterian elder, not to mention it was the only regiment in the British Army which carried its rifles into the kirk. Harking back to the days of yore, when Covenanters, under threat of attack, posted armed sentries during services. The Cameronians were unique in another aspect, that they, along with only one other regiment in the British Army, the York and Lancaster Regiment, chose to disband in 1968, completely, rather than face amalgamation. As a result, their lineage is not perpetuated in the modern British Army. However, the Cameronians, Scottish Rifles, were themselves the product of a previous amalgamation between two older regiments, 26th Cameronian Regiment and the 90th Perthshire Light Infantry. Scottish Rifles are among the lesser known of the Scottish regiments, but nonetheless were an iconic unit of the army, with their smart green tunic and Douglas tartan, and their reputation as fierce Glasgow and Lanarkshire fighting men preceded them. Our story begins in southwest Scotland of the early mid-1600s, roughly Galloway, Ayrshire and Clydesdale. The religious and political situation of the period is quite lengthy and cumbersome to detail in full, but essentially following the Crown's decision to eject ministers from their parishes who failed to accept an episcopal church, that is, a church with a formal hierarchy of bishops. These men and their followers, known as Covenanters, fled into the hills. They held open-air services, known as conventicles. Due to the imminent threat of government patrols, they posted armed pickets at the four corners of the service, a tradition that would continue until the final disbanding conventicle of the regiment in 1968. One of the most famous of these Covenanters was Richard Cameron, the so-called Lion of the Covenant, a zealous preacher whose followers became known as the Cameronians. James Cameron was from Falkland and Fife, and led a short rebellion against government forces in 1680, before facing them down in a battle at Aird's Moss, near Cumnock in East Ayrshire. Having now amassed a 5,000 merksome on his head in bounty, with 1,000 each for his main followers, government dragoons under Andrew Bruce Ayrshall, known as Bloody Bruce, had tracked the Cameronians down and fought, despite the numerical superiority of the dragoons, an extremely bloody and hard battle. Cameronians saw themselves in the same vein as the early Christian martyrs of late antiquity, and were therefore willing to put to the sword for their dissenting beliefs. Most of Richard Cameron's immediate followers were killed there that day, Cameron himself being cut down in battle. His severed head and hands were displayed for the public at Netherbow Port in Edinburgh. This period in history was known as the Killing Time, seeing thousands of Scotsmen persecuted and even killed for being Covenanters. It is one of the many extremely bloody and tragic events of Scotland's sanguine history. Our regiment first begins as an organised force in the events prior to the Glorious Revolution in 1689, raised by the Lords of the Convention as the Cameronian Guard. It was disbanded once King William of Orange was coronated, and as a Protestant, also offered the Crown of Scotland. Their services as essentially a Protestant militia were no longer required, or so they thought. In order to quell the Jacobite disturbances further north, only 1 month later, a new regiment was raised near Douglas, South Lanarkshire, with the core of its manpower being drawn from the pardoned Cameronians. Having been raised by James the Earl of Angus, whose impressive statue dominates over the Cameronian Memorial at Douglas, the regiment was first known as the Earl of Angus's Regiment. It was mustered on the banks of Douglas Water on the 14th of May, 1689, without beat of drum, or, in layman's terms, without the need of active recruiting, where the following declaration was read out. All shall be well affected, of an approved fidelity, and of a sober conversation. The cause they are called to appear for is the service of the King's Majesty and the defence of the nation, recovery and preservation of the Protestant religion, and in particular the work of reformation in Scotland, in opposition to popery, prelacy, and arbitrary power, in all its branches and steps, until the government of church and state be brought back to the lustre and integrity which it had in best of times. Some 1,200 volunteers were raised for service under their 19-year-old colonel and their commanding officer, William Cleland. The regiment was to see its action only a few months later in August at Dunkeld, following the Jacobite victory at Killiecrankie in Perthshire. Government forces were in a desperate situation, and its leaders were even preparing to withdraw down to England to avoid Jacobite retribution. The Cameronians were told to move north onto Dunkeld just south of Killiecrankie, and were ordered to hold it at all costs. The Cameronians were outnumbered nearly 4 to 1, and Dunkeld had no outlying walls, so defensive positions were few and not consistent. Jacobites were initially successful, using sheer weight of numbers to throw the Cameronians back. However, the narrow streets prevented them from executing their signature and famed Highland charge. Within the first hour of the 16 for which the battle ensued, Lieutenant Colonel Cleland was mortally wounded by a musket shot to the head and to the liver. However, so that his men would not be disheartened by his death, he dragged himself out of sight and succumbed to his wounds alone. Dunkeld eventually caught fire, and Jacobite Highlanders who had taken up positions inside various houses became trapped and burnt alive. Despite having forced the Cameronians back, the Jacobites, low on ammunition and physical energy, withdrew at about 11 p.m, whilst the Cameronians had taken to stripping lead from the roofs of the houses to maintain their firing. The Jacobites left behind some 300 dead, whilst the Cameronians only took around 50 dead. To this day, you can see the musket ball holes in the east side of Dunkeld Cathedral. William III, or II, as he was in Scotland, brought the regiment to fight for him on the continent in the 9 Years' War, seeing action at the battles of Steenkerk, where their commander, the Earl of Angus, was killed in the thick of fighting, alongside the regimental chaplain. In 1692, and Landen in 1693, following the Treaty of Ryswick, William's army was limited by Parliament, who were suspicious of a large standing royal army. To this end, the Cameronians were instead placed on strength within the Dutch army. King William, after all, being the ruler of what we now know of today as the Netherlands. They were returned again under English pay in 1700. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the Cameronians were landed on the continent in 1702 under the Duke of Marlborough, taking heavy losses at the Battle of Schellenberg, and then seeing action at the famous Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Cameronians saw plenty of engagements after this, fighting courageously at Elixheim, Ramillies, the sieges of Ath and Lille, and the Battle of Oudenarde. In 1709, the regiment fought at the Siege of Tournai, and had a rough skirmish with the French forces outside Mons, again suffering under heavy artillery fire. At the Battle of Malplaquet, the Cameronians formed a central position in the British infantry line, absorbing French heavy cavalry attack. The French commander, the Duke of Villars, even noted the Cameronians in his post-battle report following his defeat, citing them as one of the major elements in the loss. The regiment did, however, lose its lieutenant colonel, who was shot in the head leading his men from the front. The regiment saw no major actions for the remainder of the war, but took part in the sieges of Douai, Bethune, and Bouchain, before being posted to Ireland in 1713. In 1715, the regiment was sent to Scotland for the first Jacobite rising. It was the main assault force at the Battle of Preston in Lancashire, but on the first day it was beaten back by the Jacobites, but after the arrival of reinforcements, eventually won the day. Having attempted to take the town with a brutal frontal assault, it had taken many casualties and 3 of its senior officers were badly wounded in the battle. They shortly afterwards returned to Ireland, where they gained a new colonel, the controversial Philip Anstruther, much hated for his response to the Pertussis Riots. In 1726, the regiment operated as Marines within the Royal Navy, before a garrison duty a year later in Gibraltar, during war with Spain, but were not involved in fighting beyond the exchange of artillery. Here they remained until 1738, before moving to Minorca, and then to Ireland in 1748. On the 1st of July 1751, the regiment was officially known as the 26th Regiment of Foot, and were issued with new colours. They were sent for garrison duty in North American colonies in 1767. At the outbreak of the American War of Independence, they found themselves stationed in Lower Canada. An expedition by the American Ethan Allen attempted to march on Montreal with around 150 men, but was fended off by 36 Cameronians and a handful of city militia. However, the Americans sent a larger force under General Montgomery, forcing the small band of men to evacuate, sailing down the St. Lawrence River. They were soon blocked by an American gunboat and forced to surrender. Before they did so, they wrapped the regimental colours around a cannonball and dropped them into the river so that the French could not have them as a trophy. Fresh reinforcements from Britain brought the regiment up to proper strength, and it was sent to New Jersey, where it engaged in raiding and local area. In 1777, moved to Staten Island before taking part in the attack on Fort Clinton, which it took with few casualties. It returned home in 1779. Sir William Erskine, hero of the Battle of Emsdorf, where his dragoon regiment captured no fewer than 15 French regimental colours, now assumed the colonelcy of the regiment, and petitioned the king to officially title the regiment the Cameronians in 1782, and in 87 this was granted, and they became the 26th Cameronian Regiment of Foot. That year they returned to British North America, carrying out frontier duties until 1800, when on its return back home, one of the ships carrying the regiment was captured by a French privateer. The men paroled and made to promise they would not return to service until exchanged for French prisoners. In 1801, the Cameronians landed in Egypt under General Haley Hutchinson, fighting at the siege of Alexandria, where it earned its Sphinx for its battle honours, before returning to Scotland. During the Peninsular War, it fought at the disastrous Battle of Corunna in 1809, where General Muir was killed as the British Army retreated. After this, the Cameronians embarked for the Netherlands to take part in the Perthshire campaign, and then to Gibraltar. After postings in Ireland and a long stint in India, the regiment prepared for its next engagement. On the 24th of March 1840, the Cameronians left Calcutta for Chusan in China as part of the First Opium War, capturing the day after their landing with little resistance. However, the regiment was ravaged by disease in the Far East, and their effective manpower was constantly strained. Available men were mustered for the attacks on the Bogue forts in 1841 at the Battle of Chimpay, after which they moved up the river towards Canton, and then after rest in Hong Kong, formed part of an expedition against Amoy near Fujian. After this, they were garrisoned at Ningpo before taking part in the attack on Chapu, seeing very intense combat to take the settlement. On the 21st of July 1842, the 26th stormed Qingqiang, which shortly afterwards led to the Treaty of Nanking. For their gallant efforts, the Cameronians were awarded a dragon to accompany the Sphinx on their battle honours. 1843 to 1850 saw a period of home service, though stopped off at St. Helena on the return journey and formally visited Napoleon's tomb there. Once home, it was stationed at Edinburgh Castle, and in 1844 it turned out in impeccable order to be presented new colours at Bruntsfield Links by Lady Douglas, wife of Sir Neil Douglas, commander of forces stationed in Scotland and governor of Edinburgh Castle. Between then and 1849, the regiment served a number of domestic postings across the Isles, including Newcastle, Manchester, Belfast and Cork, where it provided a guard of honour for Queen Victoria. Thereafter, in 1850, it was moved to Gibraltar. In 1853, the 26th was sent to Canada, where it was stationed in Montreal. Here they assisted the local police. However, on the very day they arrived, they were sent into action to hold two groups apart following a dispute between Catholics and the followers of Alessandro Govitzi, known as the Govitzi Riots. The rioters, however, trying to gain access to the church, where Govitzi had been making inflammatory anti-Catholic speech, began pushing back against the soldiers. In the confusion, shots rang out, and the Cameronians opened fire, most aiming above the crowd's head, and nevertheless, 10 or so people were immediately killed, causing further unrest, which required armed street patrols at night. After this, they sailed for Bermuda, and then in 1859 left for Ireland again, before back to Edinburgh, receiving new colours in 1862 at Queen's Park. Cameronians left Scotland for Bombay in 1865, but did not see any action. They were part of a force sent to Abyssinia, landing in 1868, but were too late for any fighting, but nonetheless were awarded the battle honour of Abyssinia for going anyway. Whilst back in India, it was stationed in Calcutta and Gwalior, where it gained distinction amongst all the regiments posted to India, for being the best at rifle shooting, ranking second best in the entire British Army. In 1881, the regiment was ordered to South Africa to provide reinforcements after the Manjuba Hill disaster, but upon reaching Gibraltar were no longer needed and were sent back to Portsmouth. As part of the much-needed Childers reforms, the regiment was now amalgamated with the 90th Regiment of Foot, or Perthshire Light Infantry. This regiment was raised in 1794 by Thomas Graham, Laird of Balgowan, who was allowed to uniform and drill his Perthshiremen as light infantry. The regiment took part in the Quiberon expedition of 1795, capturing Ile-d'Oie, and supported the French loyalists. It was involved in taking part in Majorca in 1798 before fighting in Egypt at Abu Qir and Mandora. During the Napoleonic Wars, the regiment became known as the 90th Regiment of Foot, Perthshire Volunteers, invading both Martinique and Guadeloupe in the West Indies, and were then designated officially as light infantry in 1815 while stationed in Quebec. After a brief spell as part of the occupation force of France following Waterloo, the regiment had garrison duties in Iona and Ceylon, before heading to South Africa for the 7th Hussar War. The regiment saw action at Sevastopol 1855 during the Crimean War, where it gained 2 Victoria Crosses, one from Sergeant Andrew Moynihan, who at the assault of Redon killed 5 Russians and rescued a wounded officer. He was later promoted to captain in the King's Regiment, but died in Malta for drinking unsterilised goat milk. The second was gained by Private John Alexander for again rescuing a wounded officer under heavy fire. For its efforts in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the 90th gained 6 VCs, largely during the relief of Lucknow, where a force of British and Indian soldiers was besieged by a vast Indian mob of mutineers. The regiment gained a further 2 VCs whilst in Africa, where it fought in the 9th Hussar War and the Anglo-Zulu War, seeing action at Kambula and Ulindi. Due to the Cameronians' track record as excellent shots and the heritage of the Perthshires as a light infantry regiment, it was decided to form a rifles regiment similar to those that existed largely amongst the English and Irish regiments in Scotland. Formally amalgamated in 1882, they were initially known as the Scotch Rifle Cameronians, then to Cameronians Scotch Rifles, and then to Cameronians Scottish Rifles. The regiment, now a rifle unit, wore green with a shako, later a home service helmet, and for a Scottish touch with Douglas tartan trews. Being a rifles regiment, they also no longer carried colours, and these were laid up in Glasgow Cathedral. To reflect the merger, the new symbol and cap badge became a wreathed star of Douglas, with a hunting horn, like those used by light infantry underneath. The 1st Battalion, which had been the 26th Foot, preferred to be known as the Cameronians, whilst the 2nd Battalion, which had been the 90th, preferred the term Scottish Rifles. Under its reserve strength, the regiment also included the Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers and the Royal Lanark Militia. The 2nd Battalion first saw action at Spion Kop, earning immense praise, for they suffered tremendous losses whilst without reinforcement. 1908 saw the Volunteers and Militia reorganised, and the Cameronians now had 2 reserve and 4 territorial battalions. The regiment next saw action in the Great War, landing at Le Havre, where its 1st Battalion became famous for refusing to fraternise with the Germans on Christmas Day, causing some of their officers to call them bloody-minded, grumpy Glaswegians. The regiment's 5th and 6th Battalions also served on the Western Front, whilst the 7th and 8th Battalions saw action at Gallipoli and Palestine. Meanwhile, the 9th, 10th and 11th Battalions were raised as service battalions and served mostly on the Western Front. In total, some 27 battalions of Cameronians were sent into the meat grinder of the most horrific and valorous wars fought in Europe, at the loss of the 7,000 men and a further 11,000 injured. Many of these units had been PALS battalions, units raised not only locally but wherein men from the same streets and officers were put into the same companies. A singular mortar or howitzer shell could wipe out the male population of entire roads. Recruiting in Glasgow was particularly fervent, and there were more recruits than available structures could allow initially. The regiment was awarded no less than 7 Victoria Crosses for valiant actions on the Western Front. One of the most impressive of these was given posthumously to Corporal William Clamp. Clamp was born in Motherwell, Lanarkshire, and joined the Cameronians' 6th Battalion. On the 6th of October 1917, the advance of his unit was halted by machine gun and sniper positions in the ruins of Polkapelle in Belgium. Corporal Clamp rushed forward with 2 men to assault the position, but after both men with him were taken out, he rallied 2 more men and went in again, this time throwing in grenades. He took the machine gun and 20 prisoners, bringing them back under heavy sniper fire from nearby positions. He cheered on his men as he led them to capture some of the surrounding sniper nests. However, his gallantry had marked him out and he was killed by a German marksman. His body was never found, but his memory lives on in Motherwell, where a street was named after him. Following the Great War, the regiment served in Ireland during the War for Independence, along with the postings to Mesopotamia, and both battalions deployed to India after 1931. 1st Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Galloway began the Second World War in India and fought in Burma, whilst the 2nd Battalion deployed to France under Lieutenant Douglas Graham. It was evacuated from Dunkirk and went on to fight in Sicily, Italian mainland, and then northwest Europe. The regiment's territorial 6th and 7th Battalions formed part of the 52nd Lowland Division in the original BEF and returned to France in 1944 for the Normandy landings, as did the 9th Battalion, which served in the 15th Scottish Infantry Division. Following the war, the Cameronians along with the rest of the British Army faced cuts and were reduced to a single battalion. This was largely formed by the 2nd Battalion, as the 1st Battalion had been thoroughly decimated by disease and death in the jungles of Burma. In 1950, it deployed to Malaya for the Malayan emergency, where it conducted deep penetration patrols, disturbing and raiding communist infrastructure in the jungles. The regiment then served a series of overseas postings in Bahrain, Oman, Kenya, Jordan, and formed part of the British Army of the Rhine, stationed in Medan, Germany. Here they gained an unfortunate reputation from the locals, due to the fact that these often slightly below average height Glaswegians made several bars in Medan look like victims of delayed RAF bombings over minor disputes with locals. The Burgermeister named them the Poisoned Wolves. Often fights broke out with members of other regiments of the British Army, too, and the Cameronians were merely upholding the regimental pride. The burgomaster did not see this side of the story, and the name followed the regiment till its disbandment. The Cameronian Scottish Rifles did however redeem themselves in their final tour of duty to Aden, where they were praised for their conduct and diligence. Only a year later, with defence cuts imminent, it began to circulate that the Cameronians' days were numbered. It was not necessarily confirmed yet, however. Fearing the worst, the commanding officer took stock of the opinions of their soldiers in the regiment, mostly from officers and NCOs, asking them that in the face of potential cuts, would they rather merge or disband. The mood of the regiment was to disband. Whilst every regiment in the British Army is unique, the Cameronians particularly felt this. With the peculiar religious background, distinctive rifle uniform, and even the regimental name, they knew that no regiment in the army would wish to compromise on their heritage to accommodate the Cameronians, and certainly not vice versa. On the 14th of May, 1967, at Douglas Castle, under the watchful eye of the impressive statue of their first colonel, the Earl of Angus, the regiment was disbanded in the presence of the Duke of Hamilton, the then Earl of Angus. The ceremony was largely in form of a conventicle, like those which the original Cameronians had protected in the killing time. Their well-beloved regimental chaplain, Reverend Donald MacDonald, gave them stirring last words to march away into oblivion to.
So put pride in your step, Cameronians, for as you march out of the army list, you are marching into history. And from your proud place there, no man can remove your name, and no man can snatch a rose from the chaplet of your honor.
At last, the silence is broken. To the old pipe tune, the Black Bear, the tune with which this regiment has always marched home from battle, the Cameronians and Scottish Rifles climb the winding road across the hill at Douglas Dale, and with a cheer pass from our sight and into the pages of Scotland's proud and often angry history.
Thank you for watching this video on the Cameronians Scottish Rifles, and we hope you enjoy this journey which starts in Scotland's dark past and culminates in a unique but very tough Lowland regiment with distinct Protestant heritage and much unlike its other Scottish regiments, the light infantry tradition, marching at some 140 paces compared to most regiments which march at 116. Like other light infantry units of the army, they were also drilled for double time, coming in at 180 paces a minute, a tradition that originated in the Peninsular Wars. The next video in the regiment series will be the much awaited Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment, more than likely cut between two videos due to its immense reputation. We will see you this time next week for another folklore video.